Welcome and bienvenue to my channel. My name is Jessica. If this is your first time, greetings. If you're returning, thank you for coming back and sharing some time with me. Today we're going to be talking about some of the introductory aspects about crochet. Today's tea that I'm enjoying is called Garden of Eden. It's from Seven Sisters Tea in Ontario, Canada. So I'm going to be enjoying that as we sit down and talk today about crochet. Okay, here today we're going to start with the basics of the crochet stitch and how to start a project. Like knitting, crochet is a type of art and fabric that you make using pieces of thread or yarn. Now, I'll be honest with you, when I first thought about crochet for several years, I thought of the doilies that I used to see in my grandmother's house, and that was not something that I was interested in making. But that is not the only thing that you can make out of crochet. As you can see, you can make lots of different styles of fabric. This piece here has two different types of crochet stitches, one that gives you this kind of lacy work, and then a more solid stitch around the edges. But it's not all granny squares and doilies. You can get lots of different interesting textures, and with all the different colors of yarn that we have nowadays, you can make several very interesting projects. One of the differences between knit and crochet is when you're knitting, there's two main types of stitches. You've got your knit stitches, and you've got your purl stitches, and if you learn how to do those, you can do basically almost anything with knitting. It's all about what order you put those stitches in and if you cross them over and where. With crochet, there's a much larger variety of types of stitches. There's even different types of crochet. You can make nice, thick, dense fabric like this that doesn't have any holes or gaps in it at all, using a method of crochet that we call Tunisian crochet, which is kind of, if you had to explain it, would be like a hybrid between knitting and crocheting. I'm not going to talk about that today, but let me know if you'd be interested in an introduction to Tunisian crochet as well. Like with knitting though, once you learn how to do the basics of a crochet stitch, you can do lots of different things. You can make hats, you can make scarves, you can make little kitty cat coasters. These are a couple of tea cozies that I made with a nice colored yarn and different styles of stitches, so you can see the difference in the texture of the stitch and the finished project. So the possibilities really, once you learn what you're doing, are almost endless. But to start off with, let's talk about what crochet really is. Similar to knitting, crochet is a series of loops that are joined together to make a piece of fabric. Now, the difference with crocheting is we use a single loop at a time rather than multiple loops. So what we do with crochet is we end up making a series or string of loops starting at one end, and we just continue on chaining them together, growing each new loop through the previous loop. The trick with crochet is that you somehow have to go from making a series of single loops that are all joined together to somehow taking these loops and being able to work a fabric starting to go the other way. Now, one of the things about crochet is that it is much easier to do with the assistance of a crochet hook. So if you're familiar with knitting, you know that when we knit, we use 2 knitting needles. Well, when we crochet, we're working with a single loop, and we only need a single needle to help us create this fabric. So let's see how we start that off. I'm going to pull all of these loops out. We're going to get back to the basic single strand of yarn, and we're going to start. Every piece of crochet starts with what is known as a foundation chain. So that is the chain that we use to set up all the rest of our fabric. And everything starts with a single loop. We make a loop out of our yarn. We secure that loop and we add more loops to it. So the way to secure this loop, the easiest way to secure this loop and start off your foundation chain is actually to make a slip stitch. So a slip stitch, you start off with a loop, pull the end of the yarn through the loop to make a second loop, pull the first loop tight, and now you have a knot around a loop, and you can make this loop tighter or looser as you pull on it. There's a lot of different methods to make a slip knot. I'm going to show you the method that I use, but if you go online, you'll see lots of different people making slip knots in different ways. Find a way that works for you, that makes sense, and away you go. So what I do is I start off, like you saw, with a single loop, and then I take my short little tiny string, I make a second loop through that first loop, pull on the long end of the string to tighten the knot, and that creates a slip knot. Now you can also do this by wrapping it around your fingers. So I hold the long end of the yarn, what we might call the working end of the yarn that's attached to my ball, in one hand. I'm right-handed, so I usually hold it in my left hand. I take the short little tail, I wrap that around my 2 fingers, cross it over, stick a loop underneath, pull that loop tight, pull on the working yarn, and I get my little slip knot. And if you pull on the little end, you tighten the slip knot. Now, when you start a piece of crochet, you probably want a little bit longer tail. And the reason for that is because you want to make sure that the tail of your yarn is long enough for you to weave into your fabric and have it disappear into the fabric when you're finished. If you cut this right next to the knot so that you can't see it in the finished fabric, what's going to happen is the fabric's going to end up eventually pulling on that loop and pulling it until it pulls right apart. And then you just have your fabric fall apart. So you want to avoid that. So give it a little tail. Doesn't have to be too terribly long. 3 to 4 inches is probably fine. The other way that you can make a slip knot is to hold the short end in your hand, wrap the long end, the long working end around, cross it. So you see how you make that cross, push a loop through, again, pull tight. This gives you a longer tail, and your loop can be made shorter by pulling on the working end of your yarn. So this way it makes it harder for your work to destroy the knot. If you pull on your work, you can't pull this little tail out, which is a good thing. However, because the size of this loop is controlled by your working yarn, which ends up going into the rest of your fabric, if you're not careful, this loop could end up being quite large at the beginning of your work, and then it distorts the shape or the edge of your work. So I actually read in a crochet book once that it's recommended to make the slip knot controlled by your shorter end, because that actually allows you to make this loop disappear into the fabric. But again, it's completely up to you. Once you have a slip knot just by itself, regardless of which way you make it, and I'm just going to use this one, what we do with this is we slip it onto our hook, onto our crochet hook, pull that tight. You want it tight enough so that it's kind of snug around your hook, but the hook can still move freely. The loop is basically the same diameter as the hook. And so the bigger your hook, the bigger the loops of your yarn are going to be. And that's going to control what your fabric looks like. All right. I am right-handed, so I hold my crochet hook in my right hand. And a lot of directions and a lot of instructions and tutorials online will show you how to crochet holding the crochet hook in your right hand. That doesn't mean you can't hold it in your left hand. You can absolutely hold the crochet hook in your left hand. And especially for the foundation row, you'll see it doesn't make that much of a difference. And the instructions for how to crochet are going to be the same, whether you do it holding in your right hand or holding the hook in your left hand. If I hold the hook in my right hand, I'm going to hold the working yarn, the yarn that's attached to the ball, in my left hand. And this is how I'm going to control the yarn, is by holding it in my left hand. The way I start building my foundation chain is I have my slip knot here on my hook. I wrap the working yarn around the hook. So start with the knot of your slip knot kind of at the bottom. If it helps, you can hold that knot in place between your thumb and your finger. So you've got the working yarn at the bottom of your hook. Bring it up, over, and around. We call this a yarn over. Now, why is it called a yarn over? Because you're bringing the yarn over your hook. If we bring the yarn the other way, under the hook, it's a yarn under. And it gives a different look to the stitches. The traditional way of crocheting is to use a yarn over. So we yarn over the hook and we slide that piece of yarn into the throat, the little notch in our crochet hook right here. This catches the yarn, and then what we can do, picking up the slip knot with the fingers of our opposite hand, hold that slip knot and pull the crochet hook through it. Now, I find that the easiest way to do this is by making sure that the point of that notch kind of lines up with the knot on my slip knot. I pull the slip knot over the end of my crochet hook, and now I have this loop going around my working yarn and forming a second loop on my crochet hook. So in traditional crochet, you're always going to have that one loop on your hook when you're finished a stitch. We haven't done anything fancy. We didn't add any extra yarn or anything like that. We just made one loop, yarn over. Again, grab at the base of the previous loop, pull the yarn through that previous loop, leaving one piece of yarn on your crochet hook. Now we have two loops, one loop here and one loop here in our chain. And this is a chain of slip stitches. So if we do that again, yarn over the hook, hold on at the base of the first loop, pull the second loop through. Now we have 3 stitches in our chain, 1, 2, 3, and again, still one loop on our hook. This method is known as a slip stitch. We just slip the stitch through the loop that's already on the hook. And we can do that as many times as we need to create a chain of linked stitches. Now I'm going to take my hook out and I'm going to loosen up these loops so that you can see what they look like. So here you can see a chain. We have our slip knot, which I've left kind of tight at the right side of the work here. And we have 4 very, very loose loops. So you can see how these loops all attach together and kind of get an understanding of how these loops interact and form our chain. So if we look here at our first large loop, we have the loop coming around, going back through our slip knot, and we have the yarn coming down. If this is the top of our work, we have the yarn coming down to the bottom of our slip knot. So what we have At the top of every loop, we have what looks like a V with 2 strands, and on the bottom, we have 1 strand. We have this one, what we sometimes call a back bump of a loop. So you can see if we look at the top of the work, we have a series of these V's. This is what our crochet, the top of our crochet stitch looks like. And when we look at the bottom, we have these loops sticking down, or these bumps on the bottom of our chain. So this is our foundation chain. And like I said, you can continue on making new loops over and over and over again with the help of your hook to grow your foundation chain until it's as long as you want to be able to continue your work. Once you get the width that you want from side to side, then you can start creating your fabric. And we build the fabric from the bottom to the top. So we start with our foundation chain, and just like the foundation of a house or a building, the foundation is on the bottom of the work, and the work grows, getting taller and taller and taller. So how do we turn the work to start creating a fabric that grows this way up instead of this way sideways? Making a crochet chain, we usually have the loop on our crochet hook. The first thing that we want to do is we want to turn our work around so that we can start working back across the chain and building on it. So all this means is that I take what was the right end of the work for me, and I move it and I flip it around so that it's now going off to the left. And my hook with the loop on it is still in my right hand. Now you can still see I've got these V's from my foundation chain, and at the bottom or the back I have these single loops that we call the back bump. In order to create a fabric, we have to continue to make loops and join them to the loops that we already have. We do this by putting our hook through the previous stitches before we do our yarn over. So again, when I did my foundation, I did slip stitches. I put the yarn over my hook and I slipped a new stitch through the loop or the stitch that was already on my hook. I didn't add any extra yarn or twists. So for demonstration purposes, I'm going to show you how to make a row of slip stitches into your foundation chain so that you can start growing your fabric. The first way I'm going to do this is I'm going to leave these V's facing towards the top of my work. So remember, I said the foundation is the bottom. We build the fabric from the bottom to the top. leave your V's or these two legs of the loop facing towards the top of your fabric. You take your hook in your hand, twist it around towards you, put it through so that the two loops are on top of your hook. The one loop is at the bottom of your hook. Do a yarn over. Pull that yarn over through the foundation loop. And because we're doing a slip stitch, slip it also through the loop that's on your hook. So again, when you're finished, you're going to be left with a single loop on your hook. That's how you know you've finished your stitch, is when there's only one loop left on your hook. So let's do that. Make another slip stitch into our next foundation chain loop. I'm going to put the hook into the next loop on my foundation chain with the two legs of the loop on top, the one piece of the stitch. Let's see if I can spread this out a little bit so you can see it better. There's a lot of yarn crisscrossing. Here we go. So we've got the one bottom loop on the bottom of my hook. I've got the two V's, two sides of the V of the loop going across the top of my hook. I have my working yarn that's underneath. I bring it to the back. Over the hook. Pull a new loop through the foundation chain, pull that new loop through the other loop on my hook. These are a little bit tighter now, and you can see that the fabric is starting to grow. So again, find your next loop in your foundation chain with those two V's, two ends of the V. On top, the one loop on the bottom, yarn over the hook. So if you want to see how that looks on the top of the hook and spread everything out, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 times the yarn comes across my hook. Grab the base of that foundation chain, pull the new loop through that foundation chain, pull that same loop through, the first chain that was on my hook. I have one loop left on my hook. I have one loop left in my foundation chain here. So let's make one more. The two V's on top of my hook, the one bottom loop under my hook, yarn over, pull my hook with the new loop through those two V's, pull it up through that foundation stitch, pull that loop through the first loop that was on my hook, and that's another stitch done. Now you can see here, remember I said I left my slip knot kind of tight, but the slip knot, it still has the two V's, or the two legs of the V here on the one side, and then when I flip it over, there's that little tiny bump. There it is, right here. on the bottom. That's my last stitch on my foundation row. So I take my crochet hook, push it through that loop so that the two legs of the V are on top. The bottom loop is on the bottom. Bring my working yarn over the hook, grab it, pull it through. I've created a new loop, and I slip that through the other one that was on my hook, and now I'm at the end of my row. And this looks like just a bunch of extra yarn because our loops were so loose. I'm going to make this bigger. Pull my hook out of here. So here is the line of stitches that we just made. And you can see, just like with our foundation row, these stitches are a series of lined up V's. So there's the two legs of that V, the two legs of that V, the two legs of this V. Here's my fourth, 1, 2, 3, 4, I can count, fourth V, my fifth V right here, and then this is the loop that my hook is going into, and I can turn and I can continue building my fabric, and it will build line after line after line. Let me tighten this up, and I will give you a picture of what it looks like a little bit more realistically. Okay. So this is what the fabric looks like where all the loops are tight. You can see here, if I turn it so we're looking at the top, again, we've got our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 V's going along the top. We have the loop that we're going to continue to work in. And if we look at the side, this is our foundation row here that we've worked into. Our slip knot is right here. We've got our foundation row stitches, and we have the 5 slip stitches that we built up. And you can keep doing this over and over and over and over again to create a piece of fabric as wide as you want and as long as you want. Here's where crochet starts to get a little bit more complicated. This slip stitch is a very short, very tight stitch. You'll notice that the rows are very close together. There's lots of different types of stitches that we can do. If I turn my work around again so I can continue to work, I would have had my hook in the loop like this. I'm going to turn it, and I want to work into this next stitch. Now again, you'll see you've got the two legs of the V here on the top, and the loop is buried in here in this work that we've already done. But that's okay, because to make the next row of the work, we're going to again put those two loops on the top of our hook. So I'm going to point the hook slightly towards me, slide it under those two loops, Got my yarn, my working yarn at the back, pull it over the hook, yarn over, pull that loop through, and now I have 2 loops on my hook. If I was going to do another slip stitch, I would just pull this loop I just made through the first one. But I can do a different type of stitch that gives me a different look. One of the complicating things with crochet is that crochet evolved both in North America and in Europe simultaneously. But the terminology is used slightly differently. In North America and in Europe, the stitches that we just did are referred to as slip stitches. All the other stitches, the names get a little bit different depending on whether you're looking at what is usually referred to as US or UK terms. The first stitch that I'm going to show you is what is called a single crochet stitch in US terms, or what is called a double crochet stitch in UK terms. In order to do this row of stitches, though, I need to do one other preparatory step. And what I need to do is I need to create another chain to give me the room for the stitches to sit properly. So this is the last loop that was left on my hook from my previous row. Before I start my next row, I'm going to do a chain 1. So I'm going to yarn over my hook. I'm going to pull through a loop, just like we did with our foundation chain. So I'm going to chain 1 extra loop. And now I'm ready to do my next stitch. I'm going to bring the hook towards me. So the way that we form our stitches is always going to be the same in terms of where we put the hook. You can see here, I still have the top V of this row of stitches. I'm going to slide the hook, get the working yarn out of the way so you can see. I'm going to slide the hook under that top V. And just like before, I'm going to take my working yarn. It's at the back facing on the opposite side of my work from where I'm sitting. The back of my work. I'm going to bring it over my hook. I'm going to pull through a loop. Now, up until this point, everything is the same as what we did before. With our slip stitches, we would have just taken this loop and slipped it through. Instead, for our next crochet stitch, we're going to make another yarn over. We're going to pull that through the loop we just made and pull that through the chain that we made. This is called, like I said, a single crochet in North American or US crochet terms, and a double crochet in European or UK crochet terms. And now you'll see why we needed this extra chain over here at the end of our last row. So if I kind of spread this out a little bit, get my hook out of the way, you can see what this new stitch looks like. This stitch stands up a little bit higher than the slip stitches we previously made. If we look at the top though, it still has this V. Well, I kind of distorted it a little bit. There it is. This V, one leg here, one leg here. We've got our working loop, but we've got this extra loop in the middle that makes this stitch stand up a little bit higher, and that's why we needed this chain on the edge to give us the space for this stitch to stand up to be as big as it needed to be. So let's look at that again. We have our hook in our loop. Now our work is already tall enough. We don't need to do any more chains. The chain is just at the very beginning of the row. We put the hook under the two V's at the top of the row. Yarn over the hook, pull through a new loop, yarn over again, pull through both of the loops on your hook. So now we have our little turning chain over here, and we have one stitch and two stitches. So again, these are single crochet stitches in US terms, or double crochet stitches in UK terms. And it's important to understand that US and UK terms are different, because depending on the pattern you're looking at, it's going to tell you to make a double crochet or a single crochet, and you want to make sure you're making the right stitch, because these stitches, they're the same stitches, but they have different names. So let's finish off our row here. Again, we find our V. There it is. The hook goes underneath one loop, underneath two loops of our V, or two edges of our V. Our yarn comes over the hook. We pull that yarn through that V to make a new loop. Bring the yarn back and over the hook again. Pull that through the loop we just made and the loop that was on our hook. For our third stitch, hook goes in, yarn goes over, pull the hook out, catch the yarn, pull a loop through, yarn goes over, pull the hook through one, through two. There's our fourth stitch. And now we need the last one. So as you can see, as we've been working through the stitches, sometimes the edge gets a little bit twisted, a little bit folded, a little bit pulled and squished out of shape. So you always want to make sure, especially when you're starting, that you count your stitches to make sure that you get all of the ones. So I had 5 stitches in my foundation row. I've done 1, 2, 3, 4 crochets. I need to do one more. So I need to find that V. There it is, right at the edge. put my hook in that V, slide it through, yarn over my hook, catch the yarn, pull a new loop through, and you see sometimes what happens, this hook here can be a little bit tight. You can get a little bit of extra yarn. We call this splitting the yarn when we pick up only part of a strand of yarn. So I can't pull it anymore. I don't know if you can tell, but it's stuck there because I've got an extra piece that isn't in the hole. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen it up, my tension a little bit, not pull on it quite so hard. I'm going to make sure that everything's in the right spot. So I'm going to push my hook back through, undo my yarn over, and I'm going to pull my hook out of this loop right now. And I'm going to fix it so that I don't split the yarn when I go through. I go through a nice empty hole. Yarn over, pull through. See how much easier that was when I didn't have that extra split yarn piece there. Yarn over, pull through the 2 loops that are on my hook. I'm going to pull that nice and tall so I don't lose the loop. But there you see, there's my row of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 single crochet stitches if you're in the US, double crochet stitches if you're using UK terms. If I look at the top of my work, again, I've still got those V's going. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, and there's 5. So here's my little piece of fabric. Started off with my foundation row and then my 1 row of slip stitches. And now I've got this row of crochet stitches. My US Single Crochet or UK Double Crochet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can chain 1 at the end of my row, turn my work over, and I'm ready to start again. What you may notice, now that we have a little bit, our stitches are a little bit bigger, we have a little bit more space underneath this V of our stitch. You can actually see my finger. It makes it a little bit easier to slide the crochet hook in there. Pull the yarn over. Pull through. I have 2 loops on my hook, which is why in UK terms it's referred to as a double crochet. There's 2 loops on your hook. Pull the yarn, do a yarn over again. Pull that yarn through those 2 loops on your hook. Take your hook, put it underneath that next stitch. Do a single yarn over, 1 yarn over, on your hook, which is why in the US terms it's referred to as a single crochet, because you have one yarn over on your hook. When you go through that loop, we have our 2 loops, yarn over again, pull through those 2 loops on our hook. That's our second stitch. We do that, yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through 2, into the previous row, yarn over, pull through, pull up a loop is terminology you might hear in tutorials. We pull up a loop, we yarn over, we pull through the 2 loops on our hook. We go into the previous row, we yarn over, we pull up a loop. There's now 2 loops on our hook, yarn over, pull through those 2 loops, and you see we have another row in our fabric. And again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches. If we look at the top of the work, we have 5 V's, right? 1 V there, 1 V there, 1 V there, 1 V there, and the 5th V, 2 legs of it, is right there. We can keep doing this over and over and over again, and we will end up with a lovely row or a lovely fabric of multiple rows of single crochet. We can make a scarf. We could make a big, long, wide piece of fabric, sew it together and make a hat. And you'll see it kind of looks the same on both sides. Every other row, you're going to see these loops. You're going to see the crochet stitches. So this crochet fabric is reversible. Let me do one more row and I'll show you how it looks reversible. Pull up a loop, pull through 2, in, pull up a loop, pull through 2, go in, pull up a loop, pull through 2, in, yarn over, pull up a loop, pull through 2, count my stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. So you see this fabric. We have this row that we just created, the row beneath it. If I turn it over, again, the row I just created with the bumps on it, the row beneath it, and then that very first row of crochet stitches that we did with their little hats. And we can continue on until we decide that we're finished. Once we decide that we have enough loops, all we need to do is we need to take the end, cut our yarn. I'm so close to the end, I'm not actually going to cut it. I'm just going to grab my extra yarn, pull the end of the yarn through that loop, pull that loop tight, and there we have our finished little tiny piece of crochet fabric. made with single crochet US stitches or UK double crochet stitches. Different words that mean the same thing. Thank you so much for joining me. Come back again when we're going to talk about some of the other stitches and how the naming between the US and the UK gets even more confusing. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you, and bye-bye.